I didn't know if the way stories kind of roll out in these games in a more like text format, if that
Yeah.
feels different at all, or if it is just like basically like, hey, here's a book, dude, enjoy.
Yeah.
Or
And
light
I guess
novel
the
maybe
problem
might
with
be
that
more
is that
appropriate.
I
So
guess the problem with that is that even though I play a lot of games that are super text heavy, I'm not like a super avid reader. But I will say that like
yeah, screw paper.
yeah, no, all digital baby. No.
I think it's funny sometimes how some people think that I'm like really big into visual novels and adventure games, because I think what the reality is I've played like 4 that I've really liked. So it's really a big blind spot for me because I just don't really have a lot of context for the genre, or for the games within that kind of space, I guess. And so I feel kind of at a loss of what is the appeal of it on a broader sense, as well as what gets me excited for a new one. So I wanted to talk to Bowl of Lentils, who has a really in-depth knowledge of Japanese adventure games and visual novels, and get an idea of what makes them excited about visual novels and adventure games, how he got into the space, and what the kind of core appeal of the genre is beyond the surface level, because it is a genre that I think has a lot of trouble of really communicating what its strengths are to people who don't know ahead of time what they're looking for out of these games. So, and I also wanted to touch on like the future of the genre as well. I'm kind of curious because like I don't it's one of those things where like I see you on Twitter and I like drive by your
Mhm.
Twitter account once in a blue moon and I occasionally see, and I know you don't publish videos very often
Yeah,
either,
kinda
but
irregular.
I've watched like maybe 2 or 3 of them.
Mm.
I don't really know your general tastes in games. Like
Yeah.
well yeah, how do you describe your game life?
Uh, I generally like to say that I'm like a fan of games that have like a narrative experience, but it doesn't have to necessarily be like a story as long as it kinda like is a type of game that sort of creates an experience that gives a sort of feeling of a story. Like sometimes I'll play like shooters and like top down shooters and things like that. And it's not really any kind of shooter, but it kind of creates this feeling of like a progressing narrative. Like, oh, I'm starting out on the planet, and now I'm going up into space, and now all the big battleship that I was heading towards or something.
When
Like
you
something
say like shooter, you
gives
mean like a shoot 'em up kind of thing?
yeah, like a shmup,
What
basically.
what would what are some of those? Because I don't know anything about that genre really. So
I'm not super familiar with that genre either. It's just something I kind of like dip my toes in every now and then. I was just playing one that was made by a Vanillaware employee.
interesting.
Devil Trigger, I want to say. I'm
That
forgetting the
that
name of
sounds
it.
like a name. It could something
I'm
like
like
that could be
popping up
called.
my Steam library right now to check. Devil Blade Reboot.
Devil Blade reboot. Interesting.
Yeah, so that is a narrative. It does have a narrative. It has like a little opening text scroll, but it's not really what you would call a narrative game.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
like
yeah.
you start out in this city and it's on fire and there's like these random boss characters that show up
Mhm.
and they'll just say like crunched up English like God will not forgive you or something like that. And like and then you'll destroy them and then you'll fly up into space and you'll fight a spaceship there and it's like a very seamless like you're kind of just going from one stage to the next. So it's not like narrative heavy, but it kind of gives this feeling of like a progressing story.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know, it's almost in some ways is, I remember this came up a lot with, Fragile Dreams on the Wii. It was like the,
Mm,
environmental storytelling where it's like, there's not that many
yeah.
cutscenes in the game, but the story is told through, like, the different, like when you go into a shopping mall, you can look at all the, like, the handwritten notes
Mhm.
on the wall and stuff like that, which, I mean, is to some extent in all games, but I think, a shoot 'em up, I don't know much about them. Imagine very little cutscenes. So what you're
Yeah.
getting narratively is probably just from, like, what are you blowing up over basically? What are you blowing up
Right.
ships over basically? So, but
Right.
that's a genre I still haven't really I would like to revisit it. It's alongside rhythm games and fighting games, and
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of similar traits between those genres that really make it hard for me to get into them.
Yeah. They're
So
very, like, you really gotta know what you're doing. They're very, like,
yeah,
performance based.
I think everyone always says like the goal of those genres is to basically not have to think anymore, if that makes sense. Like, not
Right, you're just
in a
kinda
bad way, but
executing.
yeah, you react. That's the big thing. And so,
Mhm.
um, and I think that's something I'm very bad at. Like when I play fighting games, I'm thinking about what I'm doing next when I can't be. I need to have something programmed into me, kind of thing. So,
Right.
so when you talk about that kind of stuff, like there are like different spaces of games these days where you can talk about retro games, indie games. There's narrative
Mhm.
based AAA games. Is there like a space that you think you focus more on in that regard?
Yeah, I feel like you were talking with, Ray Barnhold recently and,
Mm.
like, kind of his love of Japanese games, and I feel like I've
Which
always
I found
been
out in that podcast. He was like, I just kind of like video games. I'm like, oh, okay.
right. Well, I guess I've always, like, really enjoyed the kinda, like, well, like, what am I missing out on? Like, what's going on in Japan that, like, I'm not aware of? And, like, when I was younger, I couldn't really afford a lot of video games, and, maybe I'd get something for Christmas or, buy something with the money that I could scrounge up from jobs here and there. So, I feel like a lot of my fandom with video games was just researching stuff that I couldn't quite get a hold of yet, and it kinda led me to researching a lot of, like, Japanese exclusives and things like that,
What
and
kind of games were you like, if you could have gotten, you would have gotten, kind of thing?
yeah, it was usually just, like, stuff that was, I'm a fan of, I was, like, a fan of 3D platformers back in the day, and I also really loved, like, LucasArts adventure games back in the day as well. So I, like, really wanted to play Psychonauts when I was a kid, and I would, like, see that on stuff like G4 and things like that, but I just didn't have a PS2 or and I didn't have a PC that could run it, so it was just something that
Mom's
I
like, we
didn't have
got Croc
access
at
to.
home.
Yeah.
Come play Croc.
But I just had to, instead I just had to buy whatever I could get on my GameCube and things like that I
Yeah,
had.
yeah.
But, yeah, so it
Okay.
was kinda just things that I just couldn't have access to because I didn't have the system or the money or whatever. But
Yeah. So I guess you mentioned about like Japanese exclusive games. Is that just stuff you found through like looking online, or were you made aware of it through other means? Or
yeah, it was kinda just, like, randomly searching online, but also just, uh, I was kinda, like, really into, like, early YouTube videos about games and stuff. There was a channel called, it was, like, RetroWare TV was,
yeah,
like, an
I
early
remember
one I
that
was
channel.
into.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they would always do, like, "Oh, here's this cool game that's only available in Japan," "Here's
Mhm.
this game called Ys 4: Dawn of Ys. It's really cool, and you can it's only available in Japanese and stuff."
It's weird to think about those games only being available in Japan now, because like today, obviously, a lot of that, like something like Yeast
Right.
at this point, like I think most, if not all of those, have been brought over, right?
Yeah,
Um,
the only one that isn't available is Ys 5, and that's just because it
mm,
hasn't really been made available on any more modern platforms.
gotcha,
But, yeah, that
gotcha.
whole franchise
But if
now
Yeast 5
available.
came out again, it would definitely come out in English, I think,
Oh, for
is kind of the
sure,
big
yeah.
thing. So,
Mhm. But yeah, so followed a lot of early YouTubers that were talking about Japanese exclusives. I remember watching also a Happy Console Gamer talking about the Tenkai Makio franchise and things like that, and listening to podcasts like Retronauts and stuff like that back in the day. It just kind of got me interested in learning about what are these things that I'm missing out on, and man, they got really cool art. I want I was into anime and stuff, so I wanted to learn about those games.
so this would have
But
been like late 2000s. Thinking about these YouTube channels, like when
yeah, I feel
yeah.
2007, 2008 was probably around the time that I was really getting into that stuff. And yeah, and that led me to learning about fan translations. I remember following the Mother 3 fan translation when it was still being worked on. They had a blog and I was following all the blog posts on that and stuff. And, uh learning about the Famicom Detective Club fan translation that was made by the same translator, or he had some involvement in the project. He wasn't the translator. But yeah, just stuff like that.
I downloaded, that was like one of the first games I downloaded an emulator for, and I loaded it up, got to the title screen, I was like, cool, gonna play this someday. Still have not played Famicom Detective Club today, but
Uh,
I was dreaming a big dream when I was like 15. So
yeah,
20 years later, here I am. Famicom
yeah.
Detective List.
I'd highly recommend those Switch remakes. They're very good.
Boy, well, we might talk about Famicom Detective Club later. I have some
Sure.
weird feelings about it.
Hey, sure. We
But
can get into
yeah.
it.
So I guess like because that time frame, what I remember distinctly about that time frame was that like visual novels and adventure games were not. I feel like even amongst the YouTubers you mentioned, I can't think of any of them that
No.
really were like, "Yo, check this genre out." Right? I don't
No, that
really know how people stumbled across it, or even how I stumbled across it.
so
Um,
so the way that I stumbled across it is that, like I said, I was really into, like, point and click games back in the day.
oh yeah, the
Specifically
LucasArts.
yeah,
Yeah.
specifically, like, Day of the Tentacle. My older brother had a
Mm.
copy of Day of the Tentacle that I played all the time, and then when I started to get older and had access to the internet, I was like, "Oh, these people made all these other point and click games, like Full
Mhm.
Throttle and Grim Fandango," and started playing those. And then around the same time, I also, had gotten a DS, and I remember one of my siblings being like, "Yo, there's this game on the DS where you're a lawyer and it looks like anime." And I was like,
Oh
"Ooh."
yeah.
I'm like, "That
You
sounds
know,
really cool."
that honestly probably lines up for me too. Like
Mhm.
Phoenix Wright, Hotel Dusk on the DS.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I
So
didn't
I
think about that being a connective part of it, but that makes a lot of sense.
yeah, and it was one of those things where, like, yeah, a lot of people were not really, like, at least from where, the parts of the internet I was hanging out on, there didn't really seem to be a lot of, like, fandom around these titles, like,
Mhm.
in the YouTube circles and things like that I was looking at, and it was kinda just something that, like, I was personally really into, like, Ace Attorney and Trace Memory and Hotel Dusk, and was, like, trying to get a hold of, like, anything that was similar to those games, and, like, you were talking about, like, playing Famicom Detective Club and that being, like, your first experience of emulators.
Well,
My
I didn't
first
even play it. I got to the
well,
title screen
I
and
got
turned
to
it
the
off.
title screen. Right, exactly. But, like, I remember on some random podcast, someone was like, "Oh, there's this game made by Hideo Kojima called Snatcher." And I'm like, "Oh, I wanna play Snatcher, but I'm never gonna get $150 to buy a copy, and then I'm never gonna have a Sega CD." So, like, learning how to boot up, like, Keg of Fusion or whatever it was, like, early Sega CD emulators and, like, figuring out how to play Snatcher back in the day. That's how I
Mhm.
got into emulation.
So, because like you mentioned, I think point and click adventures sounds like the main connective point there. Like,
Mhm.
one thing that's a little challenging when you talk to like a more general audience about this stuff is like trying to define like what all these games are kind of made up of. Because I
Right,
think usually people see a screenshot of a character portrait in text, and like, oh yeah, that's a visual novel. But what is a
right.
visual novel is a very challenging thing because it's a lot of different things. I'm kind of curious, how
Yeah.
do you look, genres are stupid and
Mhm.
like that they're not stupid, but you know,
They
you
are,
gotta
but
they're difficult to work with. Let's say that. And I'm curious what you view as like the biggest like pools of like what genres within visual novels, like what does it contain in there, right? Like what kind of categories would you
right.
say there typically are? I know there
Well,
might be a lot, but you know, as
yeah.
simplified as you can.
Yeah, so adventure games is already kind of like a term that's hard to nail down because it's a little vague. But, like, the way I always kinda see it is, like, an adventure game is basically like a puzzle game, but, like, set in the context of a narrative. So it's not just, like, moving abstract shapes, it's like you're a guy moving, I don't know, moving boxes to fulfill a narrative thing or something like that. It's kind of the gist of how I look at it. And visual novels are basically they're a subgenre of that genre, but specifically that interpretation of the genre in Japan is kind of how I look at it. And it's man, it gets complicated. I'm already like, how do I articulate this? Um, Let me just go through like a little timeline, I guess, because I always like to look at this stuff in like a historical context. But like some of the first graphic adventure games were stuff like Mystery House, stuff made by like Sierra Online and stuff back in the day. And basically, Japanese developers saw stuff like that and they said, well, let's make clones of stuff like Mystery
Is
House.
Mystery House, is that more or less like a text adventure kind of thing where you
It,
type in
yeah,
there
it
is
is.
some limited graphics, right? I
It's
think.
it's it's quite literally a text adventure, but then there are pictures showing what you're typing about, basically. And yeah, and you would have like a text parser where you'd say like "pick up candle," and you could see a picture of the candle on the screen, and then the candle would disappear, and now you have it in your inventory or whatever. But yeah, so Japanese creators saw stuff like that and they're like, "Oh, let's make games similar to that." And then you start having a lot of adventure games that basically looked like Mystery House, where you would type in text parsers and they would change the graphics on the screen. And then while America kind of went more towards like well, let's start doing stuff like King's Quest, having a little guy walking around doing point and click stuff, Japan kind of just kept on going with that sort of first person perspective from like Mystery House. And then at a certain point, they kind of started going back towards like, well, let's like focus more on the text and just like forget the puzzles, and let's just focus on the narrative and making choices that maybe branch the narrative. And then that kind of evolved into like what we know as like visual novels today,
Yeah.
basically.
I think from there, like, so like sometimes I have a hard time describing to people like what individual visual novels are. Like, for example, I would say I've played the game First Kiss Story and Welcome to Pia Carrot on the PCFX, and both of those I think technically in Japan are categorized as romantic adventure games or something like that. Um, but they're like when you look at them from the outside, it's hard to really tell like what's interesting about them. But what I think what makes them interesting, and this is not exclusive to these games, but like there's a sense of exploration to them. Because you are essentially having to find the narrative in this world. Now, when you say that, in the case of Welcome to Pia Carrot, that's like a menu option you choose depending on the time of day, right? So it's like to like convey that to somebody of like, oh yeah, it's like an exploration narrative game. Is like a really challenging thing versus something like I guess Welcome to Pia Carrot overlaps this a little bit, but like when I played Love Plus, the first part of Love Plus, let's say that. Let's keep the second part out where it's like free dating mode. But the first part where you're trying to capture the heart of your high school girl that you want to love. Um that it's like very much like you have to like choose different stats and that kind of determines where you go from there. And I like to me that doesn't feel like exploration in any way. It just kind of feels like I'm trying to hit some like invisible report card kind of thing. So
Right.
even though these games have like very similar looks to them and sometimes very similar concepts, I feel like the what I feel from them is very different. Um so I don't know like if there's a better way to like break down like what those kind of core elements are that each of these kind of convey through these pieces that they have.
So I would say stuff like, now I haven't played much of Pia Carrot or Love Plus. I've dabbled with them. But like those games kind of more fall like they this is another thing that makes this genre very complicated. And I feel like this is why there's a lot of misunderstanding, is because you look at all these things on a surface level and it's like, oh, character portraits, text boxes, these are all visual novels. But then you actually look at the mechanics of them and they're very different. So
Yeah.
like Love Plus and Pia Carrot, you are just, the focus of those are building up stats, and they'd probably be classified in Japan as like a dating sim, not like
Yeah.
not an adventure game or a novel game, because like the focus of it is like you're doing these tasks usually in like a there's usually like a calendar, and you have time limits and deadlines and things like that, and you're building up these stats, and by building up these stats you become more appealing to like a certain girl or something like that, and then you can continue their story or continue, trying to woo them or whatever. But
Hmm.
like, so like the focus is very different. It's like almost like an art. Like I remember, I think it might have been the guy who created the Princess Maker series, which is another similar kind of thing. But I remember him saying that these are basically RPGs, but there are no battles. You're basically building up stats to like achieve certain things, but you're not like fighting battles and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Instead you're like making a schedule and like assigning your character tasks. But yeah, so they're kind of like, I almost think of them as like a totally different thing from like visual novels and adventure games. But they just look very similar because they have like basically the same presentation if you're just looking at like screenshots of it.
So when a game like let's so sorry, I know you haven't played these, but First Kiss Story would be my other point of context maybe. And that game is there's no stats in that game. But there's a map and you select where you go on the map at different times of day And then obviously there's a hidden relationship kind of thing to it. But, at the end of the day, you're not like lifting weights, like getting buff for your favorite girl.
Right. You're not building up
Um,
your strength stat.
yeah, yeah. So would that in your head still fall closer to like dating sim, or would that fall closer to like a visual novel for you? Again,
Yeah.
genres are
So
stupid. This is not
yeah,
like a
I know.
hard
It is one of those things where it gets well,
one.
when you describe it to me, it sounds a little bit like Dokusei, which is a very early example of like a romance adventure game. And that feels like it's more like what you would think of when you think of a Japanese adventure game. But again, it's very like it's very weird to kind of like, well, this is this and that is that. And usually when I'm like trying to figure out like which genre does something really belong into, I usually just kind of look at how the developer describes the game. Like, what do they classify it as? And,
What do you
a lot
typically see for those? Because I know Japanese genres can be really weird.
yeah.
So
And they can have like very like specific names and
yeah,
things like that. And it
there's no
gets
other game in the free genre but Shenmue.
right,
And
exactly.
yeah, it's just like, all right. I'd be curious if the Japanese wiki says free for the genre. If they're just like, no, Yu Suzuki, sorry.
Oh, now I'm kind of curious looking that up. But like again, this is like another example of why this topic is so complicated. It's because when you actually look up something like I bet if you looked up something like Steins Gate, for example, which is a popular visual novel, they would call it an adventure game. They wouldn't call it a visual novel at all. I think they very specifically call it like hypothetical science adventure or something like that. And it's part of like the science adventure franchise. So it's like you look at that and it's like that is definitely a novel game. It's a visual novel. But like they would call it an adventure game because they kind of look at it as like, well, that's the umbrella term and it also includes visual novels.
Yeah, it's interesting that like it also includes more like narrative aspects in that genre. Because like
Mm,
I think when I think of like visual novel genre tagged games in the US, I pretty rarely feel like a lot of like narrative elements get tagged into that, other than specific. And even this, I don't think is very common. But like when you start tagging things with like Bishoujo and Otome for like dating games for boys or girls, right? Like that is maybe the most specific you get. I don't see like horror, psychological horror adventure or something like that, but at least in how normal people describe it.
yeah.
Like, so I don't know. I wouldn't put it past Square Enix to like make that Psycho whatever game they put out. I forget what it was called, but if they
Oh
like
yeah.
put some like genre tag on there that was like psychological horror. So
I remember there was a canceled Sakura Wars game that was like called Psycho Action or something like that. I'm like, I don't know what that is, but it sounds pretty cool. But and a lot of Japanese developers always use like weird, very weirdly specific genre titles sometimes that
yeah,
only apply to that one game. So sometimes it's also good to just look at like, well, what do Japanese wiki sites? How do they classify these titles and stuff?
yeah.
But
How so when you're looking at these games, so like my when I look at news every week, I fall into the trap of going to a Japanese news site. There's an anime guy or girl on that thumbnail. I'll click it and it's a trailer for something. And it like 60% of the time, it's either a mobile game or it's a visual novel. And the trailers for both of them are incredibly similar, where there's character portraits flying across
panning
screen
character portraits,
and
yeah.
voice actors yelling and things like that. Um, they are some of the most unappealing trailers for me because they tell me nothing. And well,
Yeah.
it's in Japanese and I don't understand Japanese well enough. Even when
Mhm.
I watch like a Xenoblade trailer or something in English, like the narrative trailers are the worst for me because I'm just like, I don't care. Like, it's just like seeing somebody crying and screaming without context is just like, okay, there's sadness in this game. Got it. Um,
This is reminding me of a very good Masahiro Sakurai YouTube video where he talked about making good trailers. And he was like,
gosh.
I don't care about your story. I don't care about this. Just get to the gameplay and the people will care more about that stuff later. Just show
He
me what it is first.
I love that he said that, but also I don't believe him. Um,
Yeah.
because so in this podcast is going to come out many months later, but just the
Mhm.
Game Awards just happened, right?
Yep.
God, so many of those games don't have any. gameplay
They're
in the
all a lot
trailer.
of I mean,
It's like,
some of
oh,
them are rendered in engine or whatever, but yeah, they're
yeah, it's like new Okami game. Well, you didn't show me anything. New
yeah.
game
I'm
from
like,
the
I don't even
Ico
know if that's
guy.
gonna be
You
the
didn't
art
show
style of
me
it.
anything. Like, I
Mm,
mean, you showed me your aesthetic, I guess. Cool. Yu Suzuki, just talking about Yu Suzuki earlier. Like, you showed me an anime girl, Yu Suzuki. What are you trying to do? So, I think they put out
yeah,
screenshots of that game later,
they
but
did, I
but
think, yeah.
but yeah. So I don't know if I believe him in that. Like, I think it is a personal preference thing for him. I need to rewatch that
Mm,
video to see if he's just like it could work in the other way. But
and
I absolutely want to see your video game
I
first and foremost. So
well, I think having a more vague thing is, like, it works better when it's, like, The Witcher 4, and, like, you already know what The Witcher is. But, like, if you have no idea what any of this stuff is, just
yeah,
showing a bunch of vague characters flying across the screen and words, and it's like, well, I don't know what any of this is. I
yeah,
don't know
yeah.
if I like it or not yet either, so
I guess if you got a brand to like hang on to, like that's enough
mhm,
in most cases. And I'm
right,
thinking about them, all those games hanged on Yu Suzuki, hanged on Okami, hanged on
right.
Aiko guy name. I don't remember his name. Ueda or something like that.
Yes.
Um,
That
so
was a very cool trailer.
I wanted to see something, anything.
Yeah.
Like the tidal wave looks cool. That's this is not
Mhm.
relevant anymore. This is 3 months old at this point.
Him going off in the
um,
little Mazinger-looking helicopter robot head.
but so I guess in bringing that up, I have a really hard time having any game that I would say fall into this general visual novel category, whether they truly fall
Mhm.
in there or not. Anything that
Right.
like gets the aesthetic of being in the visual novel category, it's really hard for me to figure out like, is this actually interesting? Unless there's like a really hard gimmick. So I'm curious, like, what do
Mm.
you find to be things that excite you when you see trailers for new like visual novels or games within that space?
Well, to be honest, I don't feel like I'm usually, like, sitting there, like, really learning about every new visual novel as soon as there's a trailer for it and stuff.
And maybe it
The
doesn't
way
have to be like the immediate like press cycle, but like, when you
Yeah.
are finding the games, even if they're old games, what is drawing you to these games? How are you
It's
getting to them?
a big part of it is just sorta like word of mouth and, like, people are
Mm,
I'm looking up articles and things like that, and people are like, "Oh, this company, they made really good stuff," or, like, people saying, like, this game's really good, specifically this one," or, like, "This author, he makes really good things."
gotcha,
And I'm
gotcha.
basically kind of, like, following, like, word of mouth and, like, "Oh, something sounds interesting," and then I start looking into it. Like, a few years back, there was a visual novel that came out on the Switch and everything called Raging Loop, and it's kinda like a story it's basically a visual novel version of, like, the werewolf game, and the character's kinda stuck in a time loop, and he's, like, looping through the same werewolf game, but different things are happening each time, and I don't think I would've, like if I had just seen, like, a picture of that or something, I don't know if it would've immediately jumped out to me, but, like, I was looking up, like I saw, like, a list from Famitsu that they did in, like, 2017, and they're like, "Oh, these are, what people consider the best adventure games of all time." And when they say adventure games, they're also including visual novels and stuff. But, like, on that list, like, Raging Loop, but, was on that list. And I was like, "Oh, what's this?" And then when it got announced for an English release, people are, like, saying, like, "Oh, this is a really highly regarded game and it's really good." And the creator of Danganronpa, he said he really liked it and wrote like a little thing about it. And I'm like, oh, well, this sounds really interesting. I want to check this out. So it wasn't really like I saw a trailer for it and it grabbed my attention. It was more just like I'm kind of following that word of mouth about it.
Gotcha, gotcha.
Mm.
I forget, do you read any Japanese or are you like me
I
and
do not, I took a,
ghosting through the world hoping you
I,
glean something out of it?
year of Japanese in college, but I'm very much a person that has to rely on like machine translation
All
tools
right.
and things like that.
Same boat as me. All right, cool.
Yeah, yeah,
That makes
basically.
me to know
Yeah,
your
yeah.
plight very well.
Yes.
With that, so when you're looking at these, obviously, there's going to be some language barrier things.
Mm,
Are you primarily finding this word of mouth through Japanese audiences, English speaking audience? I know you kind of listed both. It sounds like, but I don't know if you have like a lean either way, or like maybe specific
yeah,
audiences you might go to for specific types of games.
yeah, I mean, it's just kind of all sorts of things. Yeah, sometimes I'll be like Google translating through some like Japanese blog posts about some visual novel or like a rank of like these are my favorites or whatever. And then other times it's just people, maybe people that know Japanese on like Twitter or so some other social media platform, just being like, "Oh, this game's actually really cool, and I want to tell you about it." I'm like, "Oh, that seems interesting." Just stuff like that, basically. Just kind of bunch of different things.
Gotcha. So once you actually get into the games, I know you mentioned earlier that you generally like narrative focused games. Like, what are the
Mm.
games that typically? What are the things about games that you think kind of set them apart for you usually?
Uh, you mean like separate it from like why I like movies or books and things like that, or just
I think for me, and I don't know your history of like how many games you've played and like what range of games you've played in that regard.
Mhm,
But when you're kind of I don't know if picking and choosing the right words. When you're playing a game and it is like, oh, this is like one of the better experiences I've had or one of the best experiences I've
mhm,
had. What are the things that you think are elevate those games? Because I think obviously there's
mm,
some level of narrative, but even though many people might be like, "Hey, visual novels aren't games," I think there's still game
mhm.
elements to them, even if it just comes down to presentation and things like that, right? So,
Yeah. Oh, well, there's a couple of things in there.
mhm.
Our visual novels games.
That's
What
unless
yeah.
you really want to go in that conversation, I think it's a really
Yeah.
boring discussion because like
Mm,
there's a whole thing. Somebody sent me like a whole thing of like what is a video game,
yeah.
and like it's like a test to see like, oh, is like a screen where you control something but you can't see that you're controlling it, so it's just a white screen, you're moving an arrow around and you just have to trust the developer gave you control.
Oh my
Like, is
gosh.
that a video game or is that a white screen? And it's just like, this is a silly like,
Oh
hey,
my
that's
goodness.
cool. I'm sure that's awesome that you're having a good time. It's not really worth a conversation, in my opinion,
Uh,
for my show at least. So if you really want to address that, go for it. But
uh, I don't
I
know if I
don't
wanna
really
go
want
into
to.
a whole thing about it, but I'll just say I think any form of visual novel is a game, and sometimes it's just as simple as like, well, they're selling it on Steam, so,
Yeah,
I don't the developer of it thought it was a game, but
yeah. I think really what I'm just trying to say is like what, and maybe this kind of goes back to like what are the things that make a game stand out to you
right.
externally beforehand. What are the things that make a game stand out to you once you actually start interacting with it, I guess is what I'm trying to
Yeah,
do.
I think the thing that makes me be like, "Oh, this is a really great experience," kinda goes back to what I said in the beginning of, like, is the gameplay and, like, the narrative kinda, like, coming together to form, like, a full like, a cool experience, I guess. Like like, I know you brought up the Xenoblade games a while back. I feel like those games are really good at, like, well, this gameplay mechanic isn't just a gameplay mechanic, it's, like, part of the story. And so, like, everything's kinda, like, feeding into each other to sorta create this kinda holistic experience. And I feel like the games that I'm like, "Oh, this is what, like, elevated this game for me." That's usually what I'm seeing. And to bring up a visual novel specifically, because you usually think of like, well, they don't have a lot of interactivity. How can they really have that kind of impact of like, gameplay and narrative playing together? Like, just to bring up a recent example, it's I'll try to keep it not spoilery. I'll try to keep spoilers out of this. But I recently played. There's a remake of the Type Moon visual novel Tsukihime, and there's a part, I mean, just like most visual novels, it's just reading and you make choices and then the story
That's a part of the
branches.
Fate franchise, right? Like,
Right,
or it's adjacent at least.
yes.
So
I don't know if it's like technically, I'm gonna say yes.
yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know the full history there, but it is made by Type Moon, and just like most visual novels, it's like you read it and you make choices and then the story branches. And like there's one part in the narrative where something very shocking happens and the character is trying to process it, and then a choice pops up and it says, this is all a dream, this isn't happening, and that's like one of the choices. And then the other choices is like, I need to accept reality, this is happening. And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna say I'm gonna accept reality and say this is happening. And then I tried to select that and it wouldn't let me select it. And I was like, and it's like, oh, like the buttons don't work. I can only select, this is a dream, this isn't happening. And I'm like, that is really cool. Like that is such a small thing, but like it's using the even just the minimal gameplay of like you can select a choice it is like conveying the narrative just through that small interaction of like, he will not accept this as reality. He will only accept it as a dream. And I'm like, that's cool. So yeah, that's like a yeah, that those are the kinds of things that elevate certain games for me.
Gotcha. When it comes to the more like that kind of stuff to the side, but like when it comes to like the more narrative aspect as well, um, you know, like we said earlier, in some ways, some people kind of look at these games as just basically books with some graphics, right?
Right.
I, we both disagree with that, and that's cool. Um, um, are there things about the storytelling itself in these games that usually you're looking for as well? But like, I don't read a lot of books, is I guess my problem, and
Sure.
so like, I don't really know if like the way storytelling happens outside of like that's a very mechanical way to do it, and that's very cool, and I like that, right?
Mhm.
The way you try to, I didn't know if like if the way stories kind of roll out in these games in a more like text format, if that
Yeah.
feels different at all, or if it is just like basically like, hey, here's a book, dude, enjoy.
Yeah.
Or
And
light
I guess
novel
the
maybe
problem
might
with
be
that
more
is that
appropriate.
I
So
guess the problem with that is that even though I play a lot of games that are super text heavy, I'm not like a super avid reader. But I will say that like
yeah, screw paper.
yeah, no, full typical baby. No, but like I feel like the main thing with a lot of visual novels that kind of make it feel different from reading a book or watching a really long movie, I guess, is just that I feel like there's a much better feeling of like, and this is sort of the thing that I like about adventure games in general, is that you just kind of hang out in the story more in a visual novel. There's like a much better feeling of like you're just kind of like being in the world. I mean, some people will say this is like makes these things slow and they don't like this aspect of it. But I like the idea of like you're just sort of marinating in the like the world and hanging out with characters, and like you just take things at like a different pace than you would if you were like reading a novel or watching a movie or even just playing a game that was more like we're going from point A to point B kind of thing.
Could you maybe describe that as like occupying a space almost? Like
Yeah, definitely.
it is almost like they plop you in that room in the way a video game would plop you in that room and keep you there, basically. Um, how important do you think? Because like I think a lot of that comes down to perspective, right? When you're reading a book, oh god, I say this not having read books really, so be very clear about that. When you're reading a book, I feel like there's like a separation between you and the protagonist most of the time, and I don't know what it is about visual novels, but it feels like compared to most other video games, the perspective feels different, right?
Yeah.
I
I mean,
don't know
some of
how
that
to
definitely
describe
has
that.
to just do some of that definitely just has to do with the presentation of a lot of visual novels where it's usually first person. So, like, even, like, Tsukihime, which I was just talking about, the protagonist is, like, very defined. He's, like, a specific person, he's not you. Even in the remake, he's voiced, so he has a different voice than you. But, like, you're just kinda the way you experience the game is just, like, completely through his eyes, and the narrative is written in that kind of, like the narrative is written like you're experiencing it, basically.
Do you feel like
And
he's formed by you though? Like the decisions you make, does that feel like you are making this character a little bit of you almost?
yeah, definitely in some ways. It's also kind of just like sometimes it feels like the choices are just exploring like this is a thing he would have done,
Mm.
but it's just like he didn't do it or he did do it. And so you're just exploring like almost like a timeline that he did do these decisions or a timeline where he didn't and things like that.
I know this kind of gets back to our genre talk a little bit. Like,
Mm,
how
yeah.
many different ways do you think there is to kind of like explore perspective, I guess, in visual novels? Because, like, I feel like there are defined characters, and then there's like the blank slate character, which I guess this applies to all. It's like Link is a video game character, not in a visual novel. I've never like been the person that's been like, oh, I'm Link. But visual
Ah,
novels, I think there are times where, like, if I'm talking about a visual novel and I'm talking about like dating someone, like
uh-huh.
I talk about it in a very personal way that's different, I feel
Right.
like. Um,
Well, there's definitely well, I can think of some examples that are a little they get into spoilers a little bit for their individual stories.
mhm, mhm.
But, like, I'll say there's, like hmm. There is one game that I played where, you know, it's presented just like any other visual novel, where it's, like, first person and everything like that, and you think you're one person, and then there's a certain twist and you realize you're not even that person, you're actually somebody else, but you just don't know because you never see yourself because of the perspective that you're playing the entire game in. And so like there are definitely a lot of like visual novels that play with stuff like that and play with like your perspective of things and stuff. The titles by Uchikoshi, the guy who made Zero Escape and stuff, definitely play with that a lot.
Yeah, I think I might know what you're talking about. I think somebody at some point spilled the beans to me of what's
Yeah,
going on with that. So
you might know which game I'm talking about
yeah,
there.
yeah. So I that was on my list of to do, and that's when I started getting to like really weird video games. Which is like it's weird to say that like, oh, 999 is not a weird video game to get into at the time.
Oh, yeah.
But I think what happened then was like, and this is true today, is like if somebody else is taking care of something, I'm like, cool. I'm going else somewhere else. I don't need to talk about 999. Everyone else is talking about 999. I'm going somewhere else.
I can totally
So,
relate to that. Like I really like the Ace Attorney series, and I did make a video about Professor Layton versus Phoenix Wright. But like that is like a topic that I just don't feel like I need to talk about much because there's such a diehard fan base for that franchise that's like, well, what can I really say about it? There's already so much stuff out there. But yeah.
yeah, that's part of why like I think I don't care about playing the Saturn either. It's just like other people are taking care of that.
You're always harping on
you're
not
weird
playing the
taste.
Saturn. You said that in a
I don't want to
previous.
play the Saturn. I was when I was at the PRGE at the PTFX fan club. I had a friend there with me.
Yeah.
He does not like Sega. He's just talking crap about Sega the whole time. I'm like, when the Saturn guys come to the booth, you can't say it.
Well, I don't have. I mean, it's weird to say since I've been involved in the Soccer Wars fan translation on the Saturn, but like I have not actually played that many Saturn games. But I do hear what you're saying, where like I do feel like there's a very active Saturn fan base out there, and it feels like they're very much covering pretty much every angle you could look at the Saturn at. And there's not like I have thought of making some videos about the Saturn, but like or Saturn related topics. And it's kind of like, well, what's really the angle that I could what could I even say that hasn't already been said kind of thing.
Yeah, people are always taking care of like what's it called, virtual highlight or whatever, which is like the highlight game built on a golf engine. And I'm just like, 10 years ago I'd be all there, but now it's like known well enough that like I don't need to, I don't need to be
Sure,
there.
yeah.
So
There's speed there you can watch that on like Awesome Games Done Quick and stuff.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh there there is one aspect of the Saturn that I feel like is not explored a lot, which is like the like Bishojo games and things like that that were really, really big on the Saturn. And I feel like just no one in America really talks about that stuff.
I was gonna ask you, you talked about point and click adventure games being kind of how you got into the genre, and I think what we've
Yeah.
talked about so far, we've touched on games that have like more dating elements and stuff like that. But like,
Mhm.
if things like Bishojo and Otome and stuff, does that just come out of like a lot of those games are very character driven, right? And I feel like character driven games have become increasingly more popular today. Where like I think it's like it weirdly took over like the mobile industry, where it's just like the mobile industry feels like all character driven games now, at least with
And
Japanese ones.
a lot of former visual novel devs are pretty much just making mobile gotcha games now.
Yeah. Um, do you know like when that marriage started to happen of like adventure games becoming more of these kind of like Bishojo, Otome kind of things? I know like Angelique is like the big one for Otome and stuff, but I don't really know like what was leading into these kind of things.
So so with Japanese adventure games, they really started like kind of in the mid 80s, like shortly after they were established. They started to focus a lot more on like let's create like a really detailed image, like let's create really detailed graphics, and that those are
Mhm.
like the big selling point. And like I think it might have even been like Tim Schafer or someone that said this, but people have even said that like the adventure genre, like the reward for solving a puzzle is seeing more graphics, basically, or seeing new graphics. It's almost like what the reward is for adventure games. And like I mean, it's just an obvious kind of like, well, graphics of a pretty girl. So so like there was also a lot of adventure games coming out in the early 80s that were like based on like popular manga, like Wingman and stuff like that, which is an old manga. And so it kind of, and then as a lot of the developers started to move more towards consoles and the people who stayed on the PC were like Aerogate developers and stuff, it became like kind of an obvious like, well, let's make adventure games with pretty girls in them and they're the focus and stuff like that. And that's kind of how, like, I guess that branch of the genre started to, you know, grow from there basically.
I've only watched a few of your videos. Have you? I don't know. Are you into that side of like visual novel adventure games at all, or is that just kind of like you talk about it because historically it's relevant, but it's not something you're like particularly invested in?
It's one of those things where it's like a lot of the titles I'm interested in playing are not actually available in English. And like I did a video on Leaf and they have like a huge catalog, but like not really a lot of it is available in English. But I was really a big fan of like Utawara Remono, which is one of their visual novels that's kind of like mixed with like a strategy game. And so I would say
Is
that
that
I'm
that
like,
franchise I always claim doesn't exist?
is it? I don't know if I've heard that.
Utawaru.
Underwater Ray Romano. That's how you say no.
Yeah, these video games, I see them on the news all the time, and I've never heard
Mm.
anyone ever talk about them. I'm like, these video games don't exist. This is a
Well,
fake video
you
game.
need to hang out. You need to hang out with Trails fans because I feel like the
Oh,
Venn
Trails
diagram.
fans. Okay, that
Yeah,
might be
I
why I
feel
don't
like
see
the Venn
them.
diagram of like people who like Trails and people who like Utawara Remono, or it's almost like a circle,
My
basically.
my experience with Trails fan is only through Xeno fans also being Trails fans, it feels like
Yeah,
as well now.
so
So
I was like not really paying attention to the Trails fandom that much online for a while, and then I feel like I just decided to look at it one day and realize that most of them are also Xenoblade fans now. It was kind of an interesting like, huh, everyone who likes Xenoblade also likes Trails, I guess.
yeah, I think it's God. Yeah, I have thoughts on that, but I think, and it's like one of those things that people recommend Trails games to me all the time. Just like, okay, for what? And they like tell me all the things that I'd like about it based off Xeno. I'm like, those are the parts of Xeno I don't like.
Oh,
So
can I pitch you on a Trails game?
go
Because I'm
for it.
also a big Trails
Trails
fan.
moment, give it to me.
So we were talking about inhabiting like a space or like inhabiting a world. I really feel like the main strength of the Trails games, they're almost like a visual novel that you walk around in. It's basically they really create these spaces that you kind of just hang out in. And like all the little characters have their own little names and they all have their little progressing storylines, and then sometimes they show up again in a future game, and you're sort of just kind of chilling and hanging out in this space, and there's like all this small detail in it that you can appreciate.
Is it how the way it executes, or because like when I hear that, I think very much of like modern JRPGs like that, like a lot of the character focused JRPGs. Maybe that's what I should say. Like I'm playing the Shining games right now, and the old ones maybe not so much, but like Shining Resonance on the PS3 and eventually PS4. That game feels like that, where it's like we're gonna go shopping, and you go shopping with like one of the people, and then like one of the guys you're supposed to like not romantically, but it is a romantic thing. He's like, you're like, oh, I can't open this jar. And he's like, don't worry, I got you. And I'm like, and I like that. And it's like nothing to do with the main game. It's just like you're just having this moment with this character, right?
Right.
And the execution in Shining Resonance is a whole other thing. Uh, like I'm still learning about the Shining series because I was like, I don't know anything about this, and like everyone I ask about this just is mad that it's not the old Genesis series anymore. Um, but like to me when I hear that, a lot of times when I hear things about Trails, it's like that's, and this is true where I have a hard time like explaining why I think Xeno people like the Xeno stories, where it's just like, oh, that just sounds like a lot of other JRPGs to me. It's just like,
Sure.
and like, so I don't really know what is the reason why it gets hold so high. But it's really hard because I think the way it gets described most of the time is like, well, it's a really good version of that. And it's like, okay, that doesn't tell me a lot.
I
But
just
if you're reviewing a
it's
game, that makes sense. You just say it's a really good one, kind of thing,
I
right?
feel like specifically the thing it does better than other JRPGs is, I think I maybe heard someone else describe it like this, but it's like it's very good at showing the connection between everybody, if that makes sense. Like, you're
Mm-mm.
not just in a town talking to NPCs and maybe the NPCs have like their own little stories. Like, it's hard to articulate, but it's like you feel the connection between everything. Like I was playing Trails once. I was playing Trails the other day, Trails Through Daybreak, and they're like, you talk to like a nun or at the church, and she's like,
Mhm.
"Oh, there was like this other nun that I was very good friends with." And then, I mean, this is stuff that also Dragon Quest does, but I feel like it's so much more of a focus in Trails. And
Yeah,
like,
the priority is much higher there.
yeah, and then
Yeah.
you'll go to this other town and you'll see this other nun, and she's like, "Oh yeah, I met like, we'll just say the nun in the first town was name was Mary." And she's like, "Oh yeah, I used to be really good friends with a nun called Mary." And then you're like, "Oh, so this is the person that Mary was talking about." And then later on in the game, that you'll see that nun just randomly walking in like the town where Mary lives, and she's like, "I'm walking over to visit Mary." And then later in the game, you'll see her talking with Mary, and they're like, "Oh, it's so good to see you." And they have like a whole little moment. And it's like, so there's all these little like connecting things, and they're just constantly being added onto, if that makes sense.
So to me, what it sounds like in this case is that it's not so much the main cast; it is the side characters. Right, the nun is not a
I
party member in your party.
I
Right.
really like the main cast in these games, but for me, it really is just the characters of the world.
Okay.
It's a weird thing to say, but the selling point of Trails to me is the NPCs
Okay.
in the towns,
That
basically.
makes way more sense to me. So,
If you're the type of guy that really likes to just walk around and talk to everybody in the town, like, you get so much out of
yeah,
Trails.
yeah.
And I was definitely that kind of player. So,
Gotcha. I think the where the confusion came in with me before with that conversation is like every screenshot I feel like is anime guy with one of the anime girl main protagonists, and like those are the only things I've seen. I haven't really seen like, oh, you're interacting with townspeople on like a more ground level, and it's like a meaningful interaction, right? Which I think is a lot rare, I will say. So that would make a lot of sense.
and they all have like a name, and then maybe they'll show up in like 2 games later, and you're like, "Oh my gosh, it's Jeff. I love Jeff."
Yo, Jeff, welcome
I
back.
can't believe Jeff is back. Oh my gosh. But
Gosh. I mean, that
yeah.
sounds like something I would enjoy. I don't know if I'd be able to play
Mm.
multiple Trails games, honestly. Just like I have a hard time to beat RPGs in general, but
It's a very big time dedication.
yeah.
If I could recommend a title to play just to see if you like it, I think Trails Through Daybreak, which is the newest one in English, is like a
Hmm.
good, just like, sample it, see if you like it, and then you can figure out how you want to address the rest of the franchise from there. But yeah,
I will consider it, but yeah, RPGs are like in
the
some
big
ways
time
RPGs
commitments,
are prime like real estate cuz they take so much time, but
right?
also like random trash will get slotted in there sometimes and it's just like I
Sure.
just want to know. I just want to know what this game is.
Yeah. No.
But you know, I've been claiming I'm going to play White Knight Chronicles for the last like 20 years
Oh my
now,
gosh,
and I still haven't done it. And like the
that is a
original one, I don't
blast.
want to play the remade PS or the remade 1 and 2. I want to play the original White Knight Chronicles.
Oh man,
Let me experience it how it was meant to be, how God intended.
I
So,
remember seeing trailers for that back in the day. That looks so cool. I thought it looked so cool.
it's super slow, it seems like, and I'm
Yeah.
like, I'm okay with that. So,
Mm.
but yeah. Anyways, we were talking about Bishojo games, and then
Yes,
I started
that's
claiming
right.
Utamaro or whatever doesn't exist. So you're talking about the Leaf made those games. Is what you're saying, or a different
Yes,
company?
or
Yeah, okay,
their Leaf is their adult subsidiary. They're
okay.
kinda like, a lot of their franchises came from Leaf. They're kinda all ages. I guess they're front facing.
Mhm.
Uh, you'll see this on, like, consoles, is Aqua Plus is their, like, more
Yeah, yeah.
family-friendly name.
Okay.
But, like,
They make fighting games too, right?
yes, they don't use it's complicated. There's been a lot of fighting games based on their franchises. I think Queen of Heart is made by the people who now make, like, the Under Night In-Birth games and stuff, and they have made, I think Aqua Plaza was one of their games they published, was as a fighting
That
game.
sounds right. Yeah, that's the one I think I'm familiar
But
with.
yeah,
So, okay.
but yeah. They usually make RPGs and visual novels, basically.
So those kind of games being more character driven,
Hmm.
Sometimes I feel like that is one of the key issues with like people who don't understand visual novels is the more character driven ones where they're like you are a weirdo guy or gal obsessing over your character in this visual novel kind of thing, right? It's an otome game or bishoujo game. Um is that focus, do you think, I don't know if I would say like a negative aspect of how the genre is viewed in your eyes, or do you think today it's like a more positive aspect of being like very character driven? Like, is that a good or a bad thing? Do you think? I mean,
Uh,
it might not be either or, but
I definitely wouldn't say it's a bad thing.
yeah.
I think it's just a type of story that the genre has kind of naturally decided to focus on. There are definitely visual novels and things like that is not really, it is just kind of telling a story. It's not actually about hanging out with your favorite characters and things like that. But like you said, the genre kind of focused it more on like, doing Bashoujo and Otome content, and it kind of just naturally evolved into that. I think it can definitely in the early days, like early 2000s or early 2010s, it definitely made it an easy target for people to be just like, "Oh, that's just creepy weeb stuff." But like, I don't think it's really a negative anymore. I don't feel like that stuff like that is so much. Maybe it's just the circles I hang out in, but I don't feel like it's
I
as
think it's
much.
changed a lot for sure.
I
Yeah.
think it's just more like people are like, "This is for me," and there are other people that are like, "That's not for me," and you don't really. I don't know. It seems like it's definitely not like a negative or a positive. I guess now it's just like you either like it or you don't.
Do you think there are any kind of more mainstream views of the this I want to say genre. I know it encompasses a lot of things. This genre that are kind of like frustrating or like commonly negative views that don't feel necessarily in good faith or something.
I think the thing that I I mean, this is what kind of led me to making my YouTube channel, but just the thing, this is changing in recent years, I feel like. But I just feel like the frustrating thing was just sort of people looking at like a game like Ace Attorney or something that does have like a lot of like, problem solving and puzzle solving and gameplay, and they'll be like, "Oh, well, that's just a visual novel where you just read a story." And it's like, that's not really what it is at all. And it's not really a visual novel. It's kind of a different thing. And I guess just a lot of like generalizing with the genre that I found frustrating, where people are like, "Oh, well, all visual novels are like this," or like all these other things that are more adventure game, those are also visual novels and they're also like that. And it's like, no, it's it's more complicated than that. But I also understand where the confusion comes from because there's so much of a language barrier between this stuff, and there also is just it's confusing even when you do know what's going on,
I think
basically.
like surface level impressions matter a lot. Like I remember and I think how invested you are in the space matters a lot too. Like I'm this way with
Mhm,
Pokemon where like every Pokemon game looks the exact same to me. I know they're
mhm,
different. I know there's all these
right.
different things happening there. I have
Oh,
played Fantasy Star Universe, Portable, Portable 2 Infinity. They all feel different to me. They look
mhm,
like the same video game.
right.
But um so I get it and kind of thing. And I think like I
Mhm,
remember at the time when I first started noticing this because I'd be like I had Man fans friends who were
mhm.
like getting all uppity about like how Call of Duty's the same every year. Like, dude, have you seen the
Oh.
Mega Man franchise and how it develops? Because all those games look the same too. So
Ugh,
I think it is like a like to some extent. I think when somebody's just not invested or not caring, like
right.
it's really easy to make like surface level assumptions kind of thing.
Yeah, and
Um,
I think a big thing is just not having vocabulary for it. Like,
yeah,
visual
yeah.
novels is like a word, and when you say that, you immediately think of something, and people are like, "Oh, I know exactly what that is." An image comes into my head immediately when you say those words, and when you're like, "Oh, well, this isn't a visual novel, it's a command-based Japanese adventure game," like, they're like, I'd have no visual when you say those string of words at me. So it's kinda like there isn't like a term for the other variations of the genre.
You may not look at your channel in this way, so if you're like, I don't really think about it in this way, don't worry about much about it. But I'm curious, when you are making videos, who do you have in mind who you're writing to? Because like in my situation, as much as like I'm happy if people come to me and they're like, "Oh, I agree with you on everything." I'm just like, "Cool, thanks. I'm glad you joined in." I'm here to convince people who don't agree with me or have like some hang up about something, right? Like I feel a little bad, but like the best comment I can get on a video is like, "I don't agree with anything you said, but I understand why you said it." And I'm like, "Awesome, cool. That's like the perfect comment. I love that." But like,
Right.
and I feel bad because like sometimes people come and be like, "Oh yeah, I like loved this game when I was a kid," and these are things like I'm like, "Oh, awesome, cool. I'm glad we agree." But like, I don't get the same satisfaction of just like somebody who had no idea what something was or actively disliked something having a chance to change it. So I'm curious, like when you're writing for your audience, like who do you have in mind as like this very like mainstream level, or do you have people that are already invested in this scene, or is it like that Phoenix Wright kind of surface level investment?
I feel like the type of person I'm usually addressing is someone that is more invested in maybe just video games in general, but they have some misunderstandings about stuff, and I'm trying to clarify those misunderstandings. Because a lot of times when I make my videos, there's usually like something I mean, a lot of them are like history kind of videos. So usually it's like there's kind of a core lesson there's kind of like a core thing I'm trying to teach or misunderstanding I'm trying to clarify. Like I made that my first video was that origin of visual novels, and I basically just wanted to say, well, there's a difference between something like Ace Attorney and something like Steins Gate, even though they look the same. And something all these visual novels are technically a type of adventure game, but not every adventure game is a type of visual novel. And just kind of trying to get that core idea across. Even though I don't that may not be true for every single video I made, but usually I'm just like people that are video game fans, they sort of know what's going on, but maybe they have a misunderstanding about something and I'm trying to clarify that.
Gotcha.
Mhm.
When you are like, and maybe this is a little broad for what you were just talking about, but I am curious, like when you are trying to convey the appeal of these games to people who may not necessarily have the vocabulary or understand it, like what do you find to be the most effective way to communicate that with people?
Sometimes it's just treating the topic like it's important.
Yeah.
If that makes like I'll see a lot of videos where they're like before Tim Rogers made his really long Tokimeki Memorial video where he
I
like
still have not watched that video, but good on him for
I
the
mean,
life he lived.
if you got the time, watch it. But
I
like
do not have the
yeah.
time.
But like what that video did is that it like in videos I saw about Tokimeki Memorial before this video, it would be people being like, "Now I know this may sound crazy, but there's this game where you date cute anime girls," and they'd be very like jokey and they'd be very kind of like dismissive about it.
I've
Or
been
they
there.
yeah, I mean,
I
and I
made
mean
a Princess debut review back in the day and was like,
yeah,
"Oh ho ho, a game for a girl for an adult man like me."
yeah, and then like
Well then, I
and I mean, there's definitely a place for that, but it's sort of like,
don't know if there's a place for it in
yeah,
hindsight. As somebody
yeah,
who
maybe
used to
not.
do that, I'm just like, what are we really doing here?
But it's like this is it's one of those things where it's like, well, this is a topic that not a lot of people know about. So when you treat it sort of dismissively and jokingly, that's the only impression people are probably ever going to see about this topic. And so if you just treat it like, hey, this is interesting and important, and you just treat it like it is, that's that's usually a really great way to keep people engaged in your topic and think it's actually interesting. But yeah, like so like with Tim Rogers with his Tokimeki Memorial video, he just articulated the appeal of it, talked about how it was historically important, and talked about how it's still a good, well-designed game even today. And like just getting that message across is like important, I think, especially when you're talking about more niche topics. But
Is that why you think the historical part is like your focus? Is because there is like a need to be like there's a background behind this beyond just this particular game in some ways?
yeah, I think well, I've always just been kind of interested in history and stuff like that. And when I was like first getting into like YouTube videos about video games, a lot of them were more like history focused and like trivia focused. Like I don't know if you ever watched much of G4 or G4 TV back in the day, but they had a show called Icons.
Yep.
And they would just like, I remember the first episode of that I saw was like their episode about the history of Tetris. And I was like, wow, this is so fascinating. And then they had like a history of Tim Schafer, the point and click designer, Dave the Tentacle designer and stuff. And like him just talking about his history of his career, but then also showing like how crunch works basically, and like showing them crunching on like Psychonauts back in the day. And like
Yeah,
I
I,
just was
I
like,
haven't gone back to look at those. I'm curious, like how accurate they were because they were really early on with that stuff, but they were very well produced. So
there was a really fantastic documentary series that just got released recently for Psychonauts 2, the Psych Odyssey series. And I really love that series. And I went back and watched that old Icons videos. And it's so interesting to be like, this period of crunch that they had on Psychonauts, like watching like how that affected them even on Psychonauts 2, like the sort of toll that took on their employees, and like how that even informed like how they were making Psychonauts 2 even today. Like it's very, I would definitely recommend at least going back and watching that Icons videos if you have the time. But
I've watched that whole Psychonaut 2 development thing, which was a very weird thing because like what I took away from that was like, man, remote work sure did change like office culture in a lot of
yeah,
interesting
it did.
ways.
It did. Yeah.
Um, and like that's not, I'm not saying that as like a good or bad thing. I'm not sitting there being like, we need to go back to the office so we could crunch
Right.
together.
Exactly.
But it is like, oh, I used to like feel a little bit more like camaraderie with other people in like the office versus like when I work from home, it's a lot more independent, right?
Sure.
Um, so I thought that was like the kind of the weirdly interesting thing about that. I've never played Psychonauts, so I had no interest in the actual topic that much, but the process was very fascinating.
I've watched my brother play Psychonauts 1.
Mm.
And I keep on meaning to go and play it myself, but you get, even if
You
you've
only got
never
so much
played
time.
those, yeah,
Yeah.
even without playing the games, those documentaries are fascinating.
Yeah. One thing that I worry sometimes, and I don't know if you've had to address this when you're making your videos, is I feel like when we make YouTube videos, we have to. No, we don't have to do this, but for successful videos, I feel like you kind of have to sell somebody something before you get in. And I think the easiest way to do that is to be like, this game is special and unique, a little special little baby boy game. Um, and like you need
Yeah.
to respect it. Um, and I used to do this too. I used to be like, oh, like here's my first experience with like
Mhm.
like in my head, First Kiss Story is a very special video game. I'm gonna take a
Right.
strong guess. It's like most other romantic adventure games out there. I could be
Right.
wrong. So like highlighting it in the way that I saw First Kiss Story for somebody else, like
Hmm.
doesn't really make a lot of sense unless I'm telling a story about myself, right?
Right.
But I feel like this gets intermingled a lot of times with people where they'll be like, this is this unique special video game that happened. And because like how separated the Japanese and American markets were for so long with adventure games, I sometimes worry that like we take the like we selectively choose one game out of that category and then it's so different than what we're used to. It's like, oh, what's this thing? Like, do you feel like that's something you have to try to avoid when you make videos of like overemphasizing specific titles when it might be a larger thing as a genre?
That is definitely something that I've thought about a lot, of like
Mhm.
putting too much importance on this one game, saying it's like mega historically important or something like that
Yeah.
when it maybe wasn't.
And I think, and to emphasize, I think this can also happen within a single language as well. Like, I think
Oh,
we
sure.
do that
Even if
all the
it's like,
time,
yeah,
but I think it's
like,
especially possible with Japanese games as we pull them over.
right. Like, I remember one of my frustrations back in the day, maybe it was misplaced, but I remember there was an article talking about an eroge called Yuno, the girl who sings
Yeah.
lost voices. I forget the full name.
Speaking of like not ever playing something for dumb reasons, I had somebody like this is like maybe 2007 or something like that, 2008,
Oh
and somebody
wow,
was
yeah,
like, "You
that's
should
even
play
before the
this."
fan translation.
Yeah, and or you should look at this, and I was like, "No." And he, like every year he would come back and say, "You should look at this." I'm like, "No."
Uh,
And like I feel like once every 5 years, still I'll still get a message from him.
yeah,
I'll be like, "No."
well,
Like now
that,
I've said no enough. I have to keep saying no.
right. That is one
Anyways,
of
go
those. That is one of those games where like I have tried to play it a lot of times that I've just never finished it.
yeah.
But
I know there's like
but
it's like a time traveling thing or something,
oh
right?
yeah,
I don't know.
but like but like that game has 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 an important place in the history of Japanese adventure games.
Hmm.
Basically, what it I mean, I feel like I've researched this game more than played it at this point, but
Yeah.
like but like that has an interesting place. It took like like I don't know if you know what Chunsoft sound novels are. Um, do you know Kamaitachi no Yoru?
I'm gonna guess if I have to think about it, there's probably someone in the
Okay.
audience who has no idea. So
Okay, so back in the day there was this company called Chunsoft. They were the people who made the original 5 Dragon Quest games. They were the company that developed them. Um, Around the time the Dragon Quest 5 came out, they started to want to branch off and make their own original games that they published themselves. And so they basically made these interactive novels called sound novels. And they're basically the progenitor of like the whole visual novel genre. You know, text covering the screen, making choices that branch the narrative. It kind of basically laid the foundation for all that.
these are getting a re-release on Switch, right?
Yes, the specifically the Kamaitachi no Yoru trilogy, which is like a very popular entry in that franchise.
It's like
Um,
mystery house kind of horror-y in some ways.
yeah, Kamaitachi no Yoru specifically sort of this is something I've been researching a lot lately, so I know too much about it right now. But like, it basically Kamaitachi no Yoru specifically, which was a Super Nintendo game, basically established like the sort of modern structure of like a lot of like visual novel games like Zero Escape and 999 and stuff. Where there's like one true path that leads to a true ending where the mystery and everything is solved. And then there's all these branches that break off from that, and that you basically need to investigate these branches so you can get the true ending. And what did is that it was like, hey, there's this flow chart that operates in the background of these games. What if I just made the flow chart something that the player could see? And not only could they just see it, but they could just travel to different points in the flow chart and make different choices. And then also, that's actually integrated into the story. It's not just a gameplay thing. So that's why there's a time travel plot, is because you're basically traveling across this flowchart that was normally invisible in these games. And it's very innovative for that. But I feel like when it there was like an article, I won't specifically name which one because I don't want any heat on
Call
it
them
or
out.
anything. No, I don't
I'm
want to
gonna
call
tweet
anybody
him right
out.
after this and be like, "Hey, buddy, you
But
done
like they
screwed up."
basically said like this is one of the most important visual novels ever. Like they classified it as a visual novel. They said this thing basically created, inspired all these people and basically created the genre as we know it today or whatever. Or it made it so like, eroge don't just have to be pornography, they can have a story and stuff.
Yes.
And like
Okay.
which I feel like when you investigate the history of Arrowgate, every game, every important game is the one where they focused on the story and not just the pornography. But
Yeah.
like but like it basically was like the reason we have Steins Gate is because of And while that may be like true on like a certain level, that isn't really its I feel like I mean if you look at the history of the genre, I don't really feel like that's really what its place is.
Yeah.
And it really overinflated how important it was, and it led to a lot of like YouTubers and like people who talk about visual novels basically just being like, yeah, so there was text adventures and then there was and it was like like invented everything.
Yeah.
And like even if that wasn't what the original article said, it basically just kind of led to like it was almost like a game of telephone where like each person like said it was more important than the last, to the point where it had a
Yeah.
really inflated perception in the West, even though it is an important title and it is well regarded in Japan, but it isn't quite that groundbreaking, you know, inflection point of the whole genre or something.
Yeah. It's a really challenging thing because, like, I feel like to some extent, the way we do research online is bad. I mean, I'm sure I do it too.
Hmm.
Um, where it's just like, and history's messy, right? We're always going to learn things, and there's so many different ways you can interpret events, right? I mean, that's why
Yeah.
history books are like very like nation dependent, state dependent, and stuff in the U.S., right? Because
Mhm.
like there's different ways you interpret those events because whatever reasons, right? Um, and like with PCFX specifically, and like part of the problem with the PCFX fan club is just like I feel like the Wikipedia narrative on PCFX is like what became dominant. And I'm not going to
Right.
say that I like know all the story of the PCFX, right? Because
Right.
if anything, I feel incredibly under like I
Yeah.
do not feel like I should be the person telling this story,
And I
but
don't
I'm
know
the
everything
person that's
about
out
Unum.
there, yeah, yelling things. I'm saying like, hey, here's a different way you can look at it, and like, I just want us to consider this, basically, right? And
Mhm.
but I think it's like really hard because you have a lot of YouTube videos that kind of like find the information that's out there and then present that as like the story, and it's so
Right.
hard because like to make an interesting narrative, you kind of need to do that, right? Like confidence is really important when you're
Yes.
communicating something. I hate that it is. I love being completely inconfident. And so I try to be confident in my lack of confidence.
Right.
Whether that works is a whole other thing. I'm guessing probably not, but here I am. Um, but like it is really challenging because like it's just these narratives build up and people are so confident about them, and the way it's communicated is like this is a set in stone thing when it's just like no, it's so much
Mhm.
messier. But how much does random person like who's never going to look into this really know, right? Like or
Right.
really need to know, right? Like some to some
Mhm.
extent you simplify things, right? So I don't know how to handle that.
Yeah.
um
It's always a complicated thing. And like I made a video recently about a GBA adventure game called 01 SP.
I should have watched that one. I
Yeah.
didn't. Just as a heads up on that, but
No,
I
no, it's totally okay. No problem. And like sometimes like I meant for that to just be like, here's this really cool thing that I think is neat. And
it's the most important GBA game of all time.
and I even called the video like the largest adventure game on the GBA, but I tried to be like I put that in quotation marks because I wanted it to be like that's what the developers were calling it, not what I'm
Yeah,
calling
yeah.
it. But like it's like I feel like after it came out, people are like, "Well, this was like one of the biggest adventures. This is like one of the big adventure games on the GBA," and I hope that in my video I was like, "This is kind of just a niche little cool thing that I found that has an interesting history." And I think it looks neat and it's cool.
Who made that?
It was an arcade developer called Fuki.
All
They
right.
um they made a fighting game called Azura's Blade and Azura Buster, which I didn't know that that game had such a fandom, but like after that video came out, like so many people in the comments and stuff were like, "Oh, Azura Blade and Azura Buster," and then I looked up those games afterwards, and I was like, "Oh, they have like a fan base. There's like a
Mhm.
weirdly big fan base for these fighting games." But but yeah, they were an arcade developer and they started dabbling in GBA development, making Game Boy Advance games. And then one of the developers that worked on the game had a history in the past of making adventure games. And they decided, like, hey, let's make an adventure game on the GBA because they were like, animated graphics sell on the Game Boy Advance. And we can make animated graphics on a
Mhm.
fairly low budget with an adventure game. So why don't we do that? And like, yeah, I think it is a cool thing, but I do worry sometimes that maybe I overinflated how important it was or like
It's
how big of a deal it was. But like,
yeah, it's hard. Like I like when I made my Buddy Mission Bond video, I'm just like, I don't know
mm,
how like unique this is. I think one thing I called out is like I've never played a Ruby Party game in my life.
yeah,
So I'm just like, I don't know, maybe this is normal
I
for
I think
them.
I think that
So,
game's pretty unique in just that like it's like a fairly big budget adventure game published by Nintendo with character designs by the One Punch Man guy. It's kind of it's I still can't believe that it hasn't come out in America. It seems like such a weird oversight.
it's one of those things where like even in Japan it sold like I think it's like 30,000 copies, which for Ruby Party, all right, because you know what they're gonna do? They're gonna sell you $1,000 worth of merch afterwards. But
Right.
I don't necessarily know if that business model translates over to the
Yeah.
West. So,
And there
I don't
is
know what Otome game sales look like these days. I've
right.
never seen numbers for them. So
They definitely have a very passionate fan base. Like
yeah, but is
I
it
feel like Otome
Nintendo
fans
bankroll enough
right,
passionate? Right. So,
exactly. But like this is like another thing about one of my things with my channel is I kind of just want to show that Japanese adventure games are cool and and interesting, because I feel like a lot of times it's like publishers like Nintendo or just other big publishers, they'll make an adventure game in Japan, and it definitely seems like something that would have an audience in the West, but it's just sort of like we don't put, that's an adventure game, just ignore it. Like it's just
Yeah.
like totally overlooked. Like I wouldn't be surprised if like someone at Nintendo just looked at Buddy Mission Bond and was like, well, that's an adventure game, let's move on. Like
Well,
we don't release those, even though that started to change in recent years with like the Famicom Detective Club games coming out
I think
here
they
and
came
stuff
out
like
similar times, right? Like I don't think they're too far off from each other.
that. Ooh, I'm gonna grab
Famicom
my
Detective
phone.
Club. I could be wrong. I remember mentioning it in the
I
video, but
think it was
admittedly,
a few
I think
years before, but yeah.
I don't know if it was a few years. I made the Buddy Mission Bond video, I think a year after the game came out. So, and
Okay.
I was already mentioning Famicom Detective Club in that video, I think.
I
So
think Famicom Detective Club might have been
it may have not
20.
been out yet
Yeah.
when I mentioned it, I will say.
Okay, you know
So,
what? I think they might have both been the same year.
yeah.
But
But yeah, it's
Famicom.
interesting that they chose it. But here's where I was talking about with Famicom Detective Club earlier.
Okay, let's
At
get
the
into it.
time when I was younger, I was interested because it was Nintendo making an adventure game, and, like, in my
Right.
head at the time, I'm like, "Nintendo make Mario adventure game? What?"
Yeah.
And, like, actually, they made, like, a bunch of stuff like
Yeah,
that,
they weirdly made
so
a lot.
yeah, so it's, like, not that interesting, and so, like,
Mm,
as I've gotten older, when I look at Famicom Detective Club, I'm just like, I mean, it looks like one of those. I don't know what to
yeah.
think about it otherwise, and I call it the new one because I always can't remember the name of it, Emio Bagman, because
Oh,
I don't remember anything about it, and I'm just like,
it's
I don't
Emil
know.
the Smiling Man. No.
Yeah, I don't know the appeal of it at all. Like, if you told me that was
Mm,
like, if you showed me, like, I have this problem, and this is like my issue. Where, like, I don't like
mm,
Super Mario Brothers 3 because it's too much like other Mario games, and I played those first. Where, like, I look at
okay.
Famicom Detective Club 1 and 2,
Mm,
and I'm like, and then I look at 3, and I'm like, oh, these just I could not tell you which one of these games are
mm.
which. Like, they all look the same. So it's like,
Well, yeah, especially with the
but
modern
it's surface
remakes,
level,
because
right? So
the modern remakes have all kind of been
yeah,
unified in one style.
2 is like a Super Nintendo game, right? I think so. Like, visually, technically, 1, 2, and 3, I guess, are very different from each other,
So
right? So
the first two games both came out on the disk system back in the day, and then there was an NES remake of the second game, and then there was like a Satellaview game that is, I guess, now sort of like a non-canonical third game, I guess, because it wasn't worked on by Sakamoto. But yeah, and then there's these Switch remakes, basically.
yeah, I don't know the
Um,
appeal of Famicom Detective Club. I guess somebody told me it's the budget, that Nintendo gives a good budget to
so
those things, but I don't
so
know if that's
for
the
the
only thing.
modern remakes, I would definitely say that is an appeal. Um, I remember one of the directors on the game or somebody said that when they made that game, they wanted it to be the ultimate 2D adventure game. So there's a lot of like, here's art that's just in this one scene, and it's like fully animated, like in a lot of visual novels, like they'll have the character portraits, maybe those will be animated a little bit, and then there'll be like full screen illustrations, but those won't be animated. But like with Famicom Detective Club, it's like, well, here's a full screen illustration norm that would normally just be an illustration, but like the characters are moving, there's like camera work, like, so there is definitely like budget in those remakes specifically. But
Do you
like
think I would appreciate it more if I played the original ones versus the remakes? Maybe. I know that's
there
a
is
hard
definitely
question to ask without you
that's
really knowing my
it's hard
taste.
it's hard to play it's hard to play those because they're not, the old disc system games are not available in English at all.
I
There
just
is a
gotta
certain
go to
there's a fan
college for 6 years and I could play
there's a fan
it.
translation for the Super Nintendo remake, and there definitely is an appeal to that is lost in the remakes, because there's just something about like playing an old Super Nintendo game that has like a very dark kind of horror vibe that you didn't see too often on the system.
Yeah.
Uh, but what is the appeal of the franchise?
I feel like a jerk asking because I know so many people like it, but I look at it and I just like, I don't, this just looks like one of those. The Nintendo logo is what made it appealing to me back in the day. So when you take away that appeal, it just like suddenly there's like nothing underneath it for me.
I'm trying to like think of like how I would articulate the thing I find appealing about it, but
Yeah.
hmm.
Because Bunny Mission Bond, I think there's like
They
the initial catch on me was like the visuals, like
right.
because it like and the fact that
So
there's like 3D environments you're exploring and stuff like that, right?
so
So
specifically, maybe not so much in the very first game, the missing heir. Well, but definitely to some extent with that one too. But like definitely with the girl who stands behind, which is the second game, and the smiling man, which is the newest one. They do have like a very good atmosphere. Like there's very much like a we're solving a mystery. There's maybe some goofy stuff going on. It's maybe not like super intense or anything, but there is like a very good like there's just some kind of like dread building up throughout this story. And like sometimes things will get a little crazy and the action will pick up and stuff like that, but it kind of just feels like there's sort of like something scary kind of bubbling up the entire story, and then it just kind of all explodes at the end. Is how I specifically the second one and the newest one are like that. And that is definitely something that I found really appealing about when I played the Super Nintendo remake way back in the day, with the fan translation, is that they just had like this very good mood. And they do honestly have good little mysteries that have like fun twists at the end and stuff like that, and fun characters and things like that. But it really is kind of like that atmosphere. And I feel like even with the remakes, um they still have that atmosphere, and they especially have that atmosphere in their lighting. Like in most of the screenshots you'll see the remake, they're probably just like kind of bright, generic, what you would expect of an anime looking game. But they have like certain scenes where they like really like there's just really great lighting. Like just if that makes sense. Like there's a part in Emio the Smiling Man where like there is that the color of that game is purple. Like the logo is purple and stuff like that. That's sort of like the game's color. But you don't see that much purple in the game. But then near the very end of the game where things are really picking up, you're in a scene where the sun is starting to set, and because of the way that it's like coming through certain like because of the way the lighting is just at sunset, it kind of drenches everything in kind of like a purple light. And it looks really good. And yeah, I don't know. Maybe that also goes in like part of like the budget aspect of it.
yeah, when you say build up, is that like multiple things over the course of one game, or is it a build up from start to finish kind of
Oh, from
thing?
start to finish. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
There's not really much of a connecting. I mean, there kind of is a bit of a connecting story, specifically with the first two games. But like I just mean in like the first like the story, the mystery of the single self-contained story.
Yeah. I don't want to get
Yeah.
too deep into it, but have you played Yumi Neko or
Mhm.
Hatoful Boyfriend?
I have not really played Hatoful Boyfriend, and
Let's focus on
I
Yumi Neko then in that
I
case.
have only played a bit of Yumi Neko.
I have only played the first chapter of Yumi Neko, so
I've played the first couple hours of Yumi Neko,
gotcha.
but like I do have a lot of experience with Higurashi, which is '07 expansion's previous game. I played the first 3 episodes and most of the fourth episode of that one. I was a really big fan of them back in the day.
I wouldn't be surprised if they're like structured similarly, but I remember the first chapter of Yumi Neko, at least
Yeah,
specifically, it is a real build from like I
no,
think I think there's a
that
tension through most of that game. Like there's the like airport scene early on that's like this really nice like piano kind
mhm, mhm. Yeah,
of
yeah,
thing.
yes, yes,
But,
yes.
but everything else is like this very like tense family relationship thing, and it just like
Yeah,
gets darker and darker and darker as time goes on until the
it's
very end where like everything explodes, and that's like what it makes me think of a little bit when you
honestly
describe that.
Higurashi, the game that they made before Yumi Neko, that game, I almost feel like the pacing of that is similar to Emio the Smiling Man, where it is very
Mm-mm.
like I mean, Emio is dealing with you're solving a murder mystery, so it's not like all sunflowers and rainbows the whole story, but like it is pretty lighthearted, especially Higurashi, where it's almost like slice of life comedy shenanigans for most of the story. And but you do feel something kind of building in the background, and
Yeah,
then
yeah,
it just kind of all explodes at the end, basically. And I feel like that's what the Famicom detective games they do very well. They're almost like horror games in that sense, but not quite. They're still more mystery, but
yeah. Um, when you look at like modern games in this space, it's kind of interesting because we're at this weird point now where like, okay, the history of adventure games, yes, they kind of started together initially because these games made in Japan and then games that were made similar to it. And there's like a branch off that happened, right? Where like Japan was making a very particular type of kind of visual novel adventure game and America was making their own type. And then I feel like we're at the point now where these have kind of reconvened in some ways, not entirely, but I think if you want to play any of these genres, there are officially released products out there for you to do it. It may not be the specific one you want to play, but there are options out there, right? Um, so what divides do you feel like still exists in that space today?
Well, like you said, I do feel like we actually live in an era now where a lot of these games are coming out in America. Like I think of stuff like Paranorma Site by Square Enix, where that got like a simultaneous worldwide release. When maybe even a couple of years ago, I don't think that would have happened. Um, I honestly feel like the big divide is just the historical context. Because while we get a lot of these modern games, like we haven't gotten any of like most of the stuff from the past, especially in the console space. Like there is a very healthy there was a very healthy fan translation scene for visual novels, and a lot of like big titles got translated back in the day, like Fate Stay Night. But like there's still a lot of stuff that's not available in English, and especially on consoles. Like there's a lot of like visual novels that really were only maybe a big deal on consoles, but like they're not really talked about here at all because they were never translated in any way. So I really almost feel like the big divide is just that historical context of just I made a thread about Paranorma Site back in the day, just talking about the director, the guy who made the game. I apologize if I get his name wrong because I'm just doing this off the top of my head, but I think his last name was Ishiyama.
That
And
sounds right.
yeah, it was like I basically was like, hey, this game seems like it's coming out of nowhere, but this guy actually has like a history of making adventure games on mobile phones, like old flip phones. And they actually had like a huge fan base. And if you look at the Wikipedia page for that franchise, it's actually like huge and detailed. And there's like obviously like a big fan base for his old games he made back in the day. So
Was
like
that
when
also published by Square at the time or no?
no, he was working for a different company called Genki, and these were published by them. And I mean, it's even double obscure because it's also mobile phone games, which is like a whole nother layer of obscurity when you're talking about people being aware of stuff in the West.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But like when that game was coming out here, people are just like, this is just something random thing Square Enix is making. But then when you see it in the historical context, it's like, no, this is this director coming back to the adventure genre after he had not really worked on it since his mobile game days back in the day. But yeah, so I just feel like the historical context is the thing that we're missing.
Do you feel like, because I know we kind of, in some ways, we touched on Bishojo and Otome. Do you feel like that's kind of a different story there? A lot of times I see a lot of like Bishojo games and I have no idea if they got released in English. I know that they were announced because I'm on Japanese news sites and it's like, yes, there is a new schoolgirl anime girl game where you're like, I'm sure it's good and fine. I've played those before and like if I'm invested, I'm invested, right? But until I'm invested, I don't care. but like there's a lot of those and I don't know like if those are getting localized. Do you know if that is as well represented as like maybe the more traditional Japanese point click adventure kind of stuff?
Yeah, well, the thing is, like with a lot of these point and click titles, I'll just call them point and click titles, even though, but like these like games like Paranorma Site, those are published by big publishers like Square Enix, so they're getting like simultaneous releases, and like the Famicom Detective Club games are. But a lot of these Bishojo titles, they're usually made by smaller publishers. So there are a lot of them that don't end up coming out here. But there are even in that market, I feel like there is like a starting to be a lot more like these games are coming out pretty soon after Japan, and there isn't actually that big of a gap between them. Like Aqua Plus, we were talking about them. They've had a few titles now where like they almost got almost simultaneous releases in America. Like they made an RPG called like Monochrome Mobius, and that got like a simultaneous English release. Even though they are a tiny little, they're a tiny publisher, they're not like Square Enix, but even they're starting to, like, I guess they're seeing like, hey, there's an audience for this in America. And if we release our games in multiple countries at once, that's going to help our profits a lot.
There
And
was
they're seeing
an
a market there.
article I was reading that was like console games and I forget what the other, I think is anime.
Mm-hmm.
The export like money coming in from overseas is just like growing exponentially every
Right.
year. And in the console game market is like I think number one or number two along with anime basically.
Right.
So
Yeah, I think like back in the day, like maybe during like the PlayStation era, you could release something just in Japan, and like, you know, your team was small enough or whatever, the market was big enough that you could make a profit and it would be okay. But nowadays it's kind of like, well, if you're going to put any real kind of money into something, you might as well also release it in America, because you're just going to double your profits, or, you know, you're going to at least increase it by somewhat.
I think the last 10 years has also been very kind to Japan in the Western sense because, like, before 2015, I really feel like there was a, like, oh, Japanese video games.
Oh, for sure. I lived
Um,
through that.
yes, I did too. I don't remember. I went back and read an article that I wrote, like a terrible, like, VG247 article I wrote.
Mhm.
And, like, most of the article, I was like, this is a really bad read. And then at the very end, I was like, Japanese games should just start to be Japanese, though. They should just focus on what they're doing good. And I'm like, that's probably decent sentiment, honestly.
Mm.
As much as I love the third person shooter made by a Japanese company who had no idea what they're doing, I love that,
Oh, man. What
but
was the one made by the Yakuza studio? Something Domain?
oh, Binary Domain.
Yes, Binary
I
Domain.
played the multiplayer for that. I haven't played the
I've been
single player,
I've been
but
wanting to play that for a
I'm
while.
a Mind Jack guy, so
Oh my
um,
gosh, Jack.
which Mind Jack's not great, but I love it with all my heart. I give it a 3 out of 10, and then
Yeah,
recommended it to people.
yeah.
So,
Yeah,
um,
things have changed a lot. Like, I actually found an old podcast from IGN where they were at Tokyo Game Show in the early 2000s, and they were talking about Steins Gate, which was nowhere near, it was like hadn't even come out in Japan yet. And it was just them basically just like, "What, this isn't even really a game. This is such a joke." Like, they were basically just making fun of it. And like now it's like a big franchise in the West, and like all the Steins Gate spin-offs and everything are available here now. So,
the first
yeah,
time I heard
it's
about Demon Souls was when somebody brought in a podcast and everybody laughed at them because they're like, it's like a
yeah,
PS2 game. And then, hey, where are we
it's
at today?
it's so it's so ironic to me that
Yeah.
that whole era people were poo-pooing Japanese games so much during that era. And then maybe the single most important game from that entire generation is Dark Souls,
Yeah.
which is a Japanese game. So, but yeah.
When it comes to fan bases, I don't know how much you are tuned into them. Does it feel like the desires of like a Western audience and the Japanese audience feel pretty in line, or do you feel like there's like different priorities and stuff, um, depending on
Hmm.
the Japanese or outside Japan?
I'm not sure about that one. That is definitely something where I used to kind of lurk in like the visual novel subreddit and stuff like that a lot.
Hmm.
And so I felt like I kind of maybe had a little bit of a hand on the pulse of the fandom. But like that is something that I've definitely moved away from. So I'm not really sure about that one, honestly.
Yeah. I don't stay tuned in with like what people want in most cases anymore. I feel like I have kind of, in some ways, self isolated even more, despite
Yeah.
reaching out to people more. But
Right.
like, I kind of don't care about like. I really hate to say it, but like, especially with like other YouTubers and stuff, I'm like, I kind of rather just talk with you rather than watch a lot of your videos. I'll watch
Mm,
some of your videos, and it's like nothing against you, just like the work you're doing, I'd rather be doing on my own rather than
right.
like having you do that work for me.
Yeah.
But I'm
See, I'm
happy
like
to watch
all
something sometimes. But
I'm all about watching YouTube videos, but but in terms of like commenting on forums and discords and stuff like that, I had so many bad experiences with that in the past that I just kind of moved away from it. But yeah,
I don't know how to improve online discourse. I feel like
I don't think anyone does, but yeah.
I feel like that's like ultimately when I think about like what I'm doing, I feel like I'm like a product of this nightmare online gaming discourse thing. And like
Mhm.
everything that's like wrong about game discourse, I look back and say, I did that. Like when people get really upset about like how another code R was covered or something like that, I'm just like, fucking I was
Uh,
there. I get it. And like
uh,
I wasn't right, but I get it from the time, I guess, right? And stuff like that. And yeah, it's just I think part of me is just like, well, I know this is wrong now, or maybe I shouldn't say it was wrong, but it generally like how like the stuff I was mentioning earlier with like Princess Debut and me just being like joking about myself, like what is this really adding to the conversation, and then trying to like hopefully guide people to be in a position where they get to like a healthier conversation first, so we're not like sitting there just fighting over like what is the objectively better video game. Then it's just like all right,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that's sort of what I like. I definitely started out with being like, I just want to talk with you and debate whether this game is good or not in my early online days. But like nowadays, I feel like I kind of just want to like say, "Hey, here's a cool thing that I found," and post it on Twitter or Tumblr or something, and not really, I guess try and inject some positivity of like, "Look at this cool thing," kind of positivity into the fandom.
Yeah, one of my favorite games is one of the worst games I've ever played. So I think I have lost the like battle of just like um things I like being kind of objectively. I just don't care about the word objective anymore. I think
Yeah.
there's some things that you can say about like objective truths, but then there's like the thing I always come back to is like I like Shadow of the Colossus running on a PS2. I like that it
Mm.
runs slow. There's like it adds to the presentation for me, which is stupid. It's
Hey,
just the PS2 not being able to do it. But to me, that game has like a very like dreamlike atmosphere. And
yeah.
when you make it run normally, it takes something away. So
No, I think, hey, going back to, we were talking about shmups earlier, there are some even modern shmups that have, like, modes that have, like, slowdown mode. So, like, if there's a whole bunch of bullets on screen, the game will slow down, it doesn't actually fix that.
it gives you like a little extra time to think in those games. I feel like that was like something that I remember at the time, like people being like, "Oh yeah, like it slows down, but you like get it's like an advantage, it's like a secret advantage you get because the PS2 can't keep up, kind of thing."
I don't know if I would, like, request that to be in a modern game, but, like, looking back on, like, Nintendo 64 games, they had very muddy presentations, and they were low frame rate, but they did add something to the vibe of those games. Gave them a dreamlike quality, like you said.
If I make a video game, I should make a video game about different frame rates.
That would actually be kinda interesting.
It'd be awful. I'm sure everyone would be so sick. But
Yeah, there's that.
I can look at like 10 frames per second and be cool with it. I know most other people cannot.
Oh, man.
So, um, so one thing that's like really hard, I think this is true for a lot of games, but I think with visual novels, this maybe has been true longer, is that like when we think about like what technology can do to improve the genre, I'd say there's very little at this point when we talk about at least like the traditional trajectory of game consoles and PCs and how hardware improves. What do you think are the ways that the genre is either has been improving since that we've kind of hit that cap? If you buy into this sentiment I have, or what do you think is like the future prospects of something like that? Like, what do you think is like what will excite you in the future for this genre, if anything?
Yeah. That is a tough question because, I do kind of feel like I guess in terms of just introducing new ideas of, like, a completely new way, this is almost like a problem I have with kind of I don't know, like, I feel like in general, video games have sort of gotten to a certain point where they're just sort of established, and this is kinda what they are, and then when
That's why you got to
people
make a game about frame rates to make
Yeah,
every throw
exactly.
everyone on their head. Sorry, go
Exactly.
ahead.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that there can't be innovation and things like that, but sometimes it feels like, well, sometimes it feels like when they start to innovate things, it's not innovations nowadays sometimes feel to me almost like you're just making a totally different thing. Like, people were talking about, like, VR and things like that, and that's gonna be the future of games and stuff. And I'm like, "That is a cool technology, and it is neat," but in some ways, it almost feels like, well, that's almost just a completely different experience than, like, a traditional video game.
I
It's
think the
not
one thing
even it
I've always
almost
kind
doesn't
of
feel like the same thing.
emphasized is that like I feel like the PlayStation era, PlayStation 64 and Saturn era kind of established a very specific set of ways we look at video games now and like what makes up a video game, and I feel like we are just kind of stuck with that in terms of what we look at video games right now. I feel like we've never really escaped that. And we've just kind of built on top of that.
Yeah, and
Um
maybe it's just my lack of imagination, but, like, I saw stuff like there was a Half-Life 2 documentary that came out recently, and they were saying like, "Oh, we're not gonna make a Half-Life 3 until we have an innovation that we wanna do with it," because they were saying that, like, each Half-Life innovated, and we want the 3rd game to have the same level of innovation. And I was kind of sitting there and I was like, but I feel like if you like what could you really do? Like I almost feel like if you innovate it so much, it's just going to be something. It's going to be like their VR game they made or something. It's a completely different kind of experience. But
When I look at the last 10 years of games, the things I think about are changing service models with live service,
yeah,
um,
availability.
availability, mobile,
Mm,
VR being one of those things as well.
mhm.
If you want to be a real weirdo, there's crypto games if you want to look into that.
I'm not
Um,
that kind of weirdo.
I wish I could stop talking about crypto games because I don't even like believe in them, but like I like Japanese news publications keep talking about them, so I have to keep looking at them because I'm that sicko.
Mm,
I'm like, yes, I want to look at your train game where you build trains using crypto and like it's a
jeez.
horse racing game with trains. I want to know
Uh-huh.
about that. Yeah. But like you should never invest in it. I'm not telling you to invest in anything. I think gamified investment is like a very devious thing.
It's it gets into gambling territory for me, and I always feel sort
Yeah.
of icky about that.
There's a whole thing with like and like I think there's like something to be said about gambling where like I think to some extent there's some human nature in gambling, right?
Mhm.
But the thing is when you start emotionally manipulating people
Yeah.
uh make them bet against their livelihoods.
Yes.
Anyways, but that being said,
That's a whole nother topic of conversation.
God, I if I could find like a level-headed person someday that's not like a crazy person to talk
Uh-huh.
about crypto games, I would love it. But everyone looks like a crazy person. So I'm like, I don't want to talk to you because it's like you are like
Yeah.
sitting here telling me that this is the future. And look, I'm a dumb boy. I'm not gonna
Mhm.
sit there and claim I know shit about that shit. But
Mhm.
the pretty clear trajectory right now to me is that this is not the future right now. I'm not saying it isn't. I will never sit there and say I know anything.
I'll say
But
that it
anyways,
isn't. I'll be that brave person.
I know I'm a stupid boy and like
Uh,
I there are many times in my life I've been wrong about things and I don't want to sit there and act like I've been right about it.
sure.
Anyways, but like that's I didn't even mean to bring this up. I was just mostly joking.
It's okay.
Um, when we look at things like mobile life service, VR, what would you say are the ways those things have impacted this genre, if at all?
Well,
And crypto, of course.
definitely with like mobile, we kind of touched on it a bit ago, but I feel like a lot of visual novel developers have pivoted towards like mobile gotcha games and things like that.
Mhm.
Like we were talking about Tight Moon, every now and then they are making a traditional visual novel like the Tsukihime remake, but like their main business is making Fate Grand Order, which is
Mhm.
like a huge, gotcha RPG.
I think
And
Atlas Soft makes a mobile game now too, if I recall
I think
correctly.
so. Yeah, that
Yeah.
sounds right. I know Visual Arts. I cannot remember the name of the game, but I think it recently got an English release. But Visual Arts, the company that owns Key, who made like Clannad and
Oh,
other
gotcha. Yeah, yeah,
famous
yeah.
visual novels, they
Heaven's
have a
Burn
mobile.
Red or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's what the title was. Like they had their own mobile gotcha game. There
Which
was
does
even
very well. It is almost always on the
yeah, and
in charts in
I've
Japan.
and I've heard
So
it's really good. It's just not something I'm personally interested in, but I've heard it's very good. But and this is even a topic, and there's an anime called, I think it's 16-bit Sensations, where it's about a girl who travels back in time and learns about the history of eroge and stuff like that. And there's a part where she's like, "Oh, all these visual novel developers and eroge developers are just making mobile gotcha games, and like they're not making the real stuff." But yeah, that I feel like that's kind of where I almost feel like that's kind of where the market went, is it went towards like gotcha and stuff.
do
And
you
that
echo that sentiment of like this is not the real stuff?
for me personally, it's not the real stuff. Just just because like I'm just not really into gotcha games. But there's a lot of people that do enjoy those things. But it's to me, it's not the real stuff just because it's not the thing I'm interested in. But that's just a personal thing. Hmm. And in terms of VR, I think there are some visual novels that experimented with VR, but again, that's a thing that I'm not as familiar with.
Would you be interested in it if you had like a VR headset set up to check it out, or not
If
interested at
someone
all?
if someone gave me a headset, I would definitely check them out, but it's just something I can't personally invest in. It's just too big
Yeah.
of a money thing for me.
So I guess within that sentiment, like, what do you see it as something where in the future there's something you'd be like, I think this is like a what makes this future bright to you at all for this genre? Maybe that's what I'm asking. It's
I
just like
feel like
what are you looking forward to where
the
this
thing
genre's going?
I'm looking forward to is more just hmm,
Or maybe like how do you just view their place in the industry today, maybe?
well, it's more I'm more hopeful and excited about just the fact that these things are becoming more available outside of Japan. And we are actually seeing like localizations of some older games and things like that now too. Like uh like Fate Stay Night, that's a very popular visual novel. It was not actually officially available in English until this year. There had been fan translations and things like that, but now they're actually getting officially localized and you can just buy it on the Switch. Like it's just something that you can just buy now. And that is something that I'm excited about. Just things being available, like things like people just being able to play them. but like but yeah, in terms of like future innovations and stuff like that, I'm not sure. But I'm also excited about there just seems to be a lot of like indie developers that are now making more games inspired by these Japanese titles. Like this is a little bit of self-advertising because I helped do some playtesting for this game. But there's a title called Detective Instincts that's currently in development. It's about like a murder mystery on a train. And it's very much inspired by like Famicom Detective Club and stuff like that and like DS adventure games from back in the day. And like I think it's cool that there are like now like maybe there's more people like me that grew up with the DS and played these adventure games and now they're making games inspired by them. And maybe there'll be a lot of new ideas that come out of those games. But yeah, I'm just happy that they're starting to get more of a spotlight put on them and they're starting to become more available.
In rewatching this episode, I think the thing that I was most surprised by was the amount of back and forth I did here. I think the core concept of this episode was focusing on, in a lot of ways, how easy it is to kind of like overlook the strengths of adventure games and visual novels and how hard it is to understand the appeal. And you would think, in me understanding that, like, I would live by that understanding and that principle that, like, oh, there's probably more here. But meanwhile, mid this episode, I'm doing like this weird back and forth thing where I'm like dismissive of certain games like Uta Watari Mono and the Trails games and things like that. And also, you know, I had this thing where I was talking about how Pokemon games kind of all look the same, but I know they're different because I've talked enough to people who enjoy those games to know that a lot of those games have their individual values and strengths, right? But I don't give that same consideration to Famicom Detective Club for some reason. It's this weird, like, hypocritical thing that, like, I don't necessarily know why I'm doing it, but at the same time, I feel guilty about it, and I think that's why I do actively, you know, kind of shame myself for making those kind of statements, despite me, you know, doing it in like a very joking manner. And like, there's always place for jokes and stuff like that, right? But I think, you know, the thing we kind of emphasized today was, at the end of the day, you know, these games are only as serious as people take them, right? And when you have genres and franchises and things like that that are struggling with that, maybe not so much Trails anymore, you know, I think there is something to be said about like wanting to make sure the conversation around those games is like healthy and positive, right? And I feel like I didn't quite do that here today. And I think part of the problem is that, you know, I really have a love for having deeper understandings of why we like games, right? And I think like very human understandings as well, right? I don't really like it being boiled down to like a science at the same time. But at the same time, I then am like applying those standards of like how I like to think and talk about games to people who probably just want to enjoy Trails games or something like that, right? And so like for some reason I get like weirdly flustered when people can't like explain the reason why they like their games beyond just saying things like it's really good. This is one of the best JRPGs I ever played or something like that. Right? One of the best adventure games I ever played, right? And for some reason I just like put heat on the game as like a response to that. And there's probably a place to push in those situations where you want, to work with someone to help them better understand why they feel they enjoy things, right? Especially if they're looking for ways to kind of communicate the strengths of a game. If they're trying to celebrate a game and they're just having trouble finding the words. But I do feel like, it can feel more like bullying at times when I do this weird thing with it. But, I don't think, I don't have any, poor meaning in it or anything like that. But I just thought it was fascinating to sit here and watch me go back and forth and like do the exact thing we're talking about like mid-show. I don't know. It's just kind of interesting. So not that I like feel super bad about it, but just, it's lessons learned. We're here to learn lessons, and you're here to check out Bowl of Lentils stuff. Did you know Bowl of Lentils has a YouTube channel where they've made videos about Leaf, Falcom, Mystery House, and also the one, probably my favorite video of the ones I've watched is this one where it's like a weird DVD company who is making like visual novels on DVDs. I think that was like a really cool thing going on. I have a friend who actually apparently was like really into them. I think he has a small collection of them. So, and then in addition to that, if YouTube is not your thing, hey, Sakura Tyson, Sakura Wars, everybody's favorite Sega Saturn game. Bowl of Lentils has done the translation, or is an editor on the translation for those. And I think Sakura Tyson 1 has been out for a while now, so go check that out if you want. And they're also working on Sakura Tyson 2, so keep an eye out for that. But Sakura Tyson 1 is out there in the wild, ready for you to consume in English if you really want to. So go check those things out. And I'll try not to belittle Sakura Tyson either, possibly. I don't know. I haven't really thought about Sakura Tyson that much, but I'm here to hopefully do better someday. Tomorrow. Let's say tomorrow. I'll be considerate to Sakura Tyson tomorrow.